There's a statistic that Wall Street loves to repeat whenever a new conflict breaks out. In 20 wars since the end of World War II, the S&P 500 fell an average of only 6%. 6. Sarcastic. That's barely a rough Monday in a bad earnings season. And analysts love to point at that number and say, stay calm, stay invested, history is on your side. I've studied that number. I know where it comes from. And I want to tell you something that almost no financial commentator is saying out loud right now. That 6% average is real. The data is solid. RBC analyst Kelly Bogdanova documented it carefully. 20 conflicts, measured drawdowns, recoveries. The math checks out. Serious. But a number doesn't tell you anything unless you understand what it's measuring. And here's what that 6% was measuring. Wars fought far away over limited objectives, between parties who all still needed the global financial system to keep functioning. This war is different, and I don't mean that emotionally, I mean it structurally. The simplest way I can put it is this. When two neighbors argue about a fence, property values on the street might dip slightly. When the argument is about who owns the street itself, who controls the infrastructure beneath every house, that's not a 6% problem. That's a different category of risk entirely. Let me show you what I found when I looked beneath the surface. The 20 wars in that historical dataset share something important. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, even the conflicts in the early 2000s, in every single case, the global dollar system remained intact. Trade continued. The SWIFT banking network kept clearing transactions. The reserve currency didn't come into question. Thoughtful investors knew that whatever happened on the battlefield, the financial rails would keep running underneath. What we are watching now is the first major prolonged conflict since World War II in which the financial rails themselves are part of the battlefield. Sanctions, asset freezes, the weaponization of SWIFT access, parallel payment systems emerging between major economies. These are not peripheral effects. They are the central mechanism of the conflict. Curious. Think about what that means for a moment in terms you'd use in your own life. Imagine you have money in a savings account, and the bank itself becomes the site of a dispute. The question is no longer whether your balance goes up or down. The question is whether the account still means what you thought it meant. Size. That's the conversation the mainstream financial press is not having. They keep measuring the S&P 500 drawdown and saying 6%. They're counting the ripples. They're not asking what happens to the water. Here is the mechanism that concerns me most, and I want to walk you through it carefully because it's not complicated. It's just uncomfortable. For the past 80 years, the United States dollar has operated as the world's reserve currency. What that means practically is that when Brazil buys oil from Saudi Arabia, they pay in dollars. When a Vietnamese manufacturer exports goods to Germany, the transaction is often settled in dollars. Dollar demand is structural, global, and continuous. It has nothing to do with America's trade balance or even its domestic politics. Thoughtful. That structural demand is what makes U.S. Treasury bonds the most reliable store of value on earth. Countries don't buy treasuries because they love Washington. They buy them because they need dollars, and treasuries are the safest way to hold dollars at scale. Now, curious. What happens when a significant portion of the world's economies, representing somewhere between 30 and 40% of global GDP according to IMF data, begins building alternative systems, not replacing the dollar overnight, tomorrow, but constructing the pipes, the payment networks, the commodity pricing agreements that could allow trade to happen outside the dollar system over a 10 to 20-year horizon? Curious. That's not a 6% problem. That is a structural shift in who the buyers of U.S. debt are and on what terms they're willing to buy it. Here's where the hidden winner comes in, and this is the piece that almost nobody talks about. In every zero-sum game, when something loses value somewhere, that value doesn't disappear. It moves. In the conflicts that produced the 6% average, the money that briefly left equities moved into short-term treasuries, then moved back. The system was a closed loop. Curious. In a conflict where the system itself is contested, the money moves differently. Hard assets, commodities, gold, which has already moved significantly more than 6% from its pre-conflict lows, according to data from the World Gold Council. Agricultural land, energy infrastructure in politically stable regions, and currencies and bonds of countries positioned as neutral nodes in the new global trade architecture. Thoughtful. The investors who have done well in the past 3 years are not the ones who measured the S&P drawdown and stayed put. They're the ones who asked a different question. In a world where the financial rails are being rerouted, who benefits? TS from the rerouting? I want to be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not predicting a collapse of the dollar system. Institutions built over 80 years don't collapse in 3. What I'm saying is that the risk premium, the extra uncertainty that should be priced into any asset that depends on the dollar system remaining unchallenged, is currently underpriced. The market is still using a 6% mental model for a problem that has a different structure. When the Gulf War began in 1990, the S&P fell about 17% and recovered within months. Why? Because the conflict was ultimately about who controlled oil within a system that all parties still used. The petrodollar wasn't threatened. The SWIFT network wasn't threatened. The Federal Reserve's role as the backstop for global liquidity wasn't questioned. Curious, compare that to the current environment. You have major central banks reducing their treasury holdings. You have commodity trades being settled in non-dollar currencies for the first time in decades. You have parallel payment infrastructure being built at speed. Not one of those things showed up in the Gulf War dataset. Thoughtful. Let me translate this into what it actually means for a person who is watching their retirement account, their investment portfolio, or simply the purchasing power of their savings. The 6% historical average is essentially telling you, in normal geopolitical stress, stay the course. It recovers. That advice is correct for normal geopolitical stress. The critical thinking that the mainstream narrative is skipping is the question of whether this qualifies as normal geopolitical stress. My honest read, having looked at the data carefully and without the pressure to be optimistic that financial media faces, is that this does not qualify. The conflict has elements, specifically the direct targeting of financial infrastructure as a weapon, and the accelerated construction of alternative systems by economies representing a significant share of global activity, that simply weren't present in any of the 20 wars in that dataset. Thoughtful. What does that mean practically? Not panic, not liquidation, but it does mean that a portfolio built entirely on the assumption that the dollar system will operate in 2035 exactly as it operated in 2005 carries risk that isn't being adequately priced. Curious. The scenarios worth thinking about are not binary. It's not dollar collapse versus complete stability. The more likely paths fall somewhere in the middle. Curious. In the first scenario, the conflict de-escalates, alternative payment systems remain marginal, and the dollar's structural role is maintained. In this case, the 6% mental model was roughly correct, and the S&P recovers along historical lines. This is the scenario the market is currently pricing. In the second scenario, alternative systems gain meaningful adoption. Not dominance, but enough to reduce the structural demand for dollars by 15 to 20% over a decade. In this case, Treasury yields rise over time as foreign demand softens, which pressures equity valuations, which means the drawdown is not 6%, but something more sustained and more structurally significant. Curious. In the third scenario, a specific triggering event, perhaps involving the energy trade or a major holder of U.S. debt making a visible move, accelerates the timeline. In this case, the adjustment happens faster and is more disruptive than either of the first two scenarios. Thoughtful. In the fourth scenario, the U.S. successfully restructures its strategic relationships. The conflict resolves in a way that reinforces rather than undermines the existing financial architecture, and the alternative systems that have been built remain interoperable rather than competitive. This outcome is possible. It requires a level of coordination that has not been historically common, but it is not off the table. Size. The honest answer is that none of us knows which of these paths we're on. What we can observe is which one the market is pricing. And right now, the market is pricing scenario 1 with very high confidence, while the data on the ground is at minimum ambiguous between all four. Here's what I want you to take away from this. The person this matters most to is not the sophisticated institutional investor. They have entire teams analyzing these questions. The person this matters to is you, the critical thinker who looks at headlines saying markets are resilient, the 6% average holds, history is on your side, and something doesn't quite add up. Curious. Your instinct is correct. Something structural is different this time. Not catastrophically different necessarily, but different enough that the right response is not to use a data set from 20 past wars as your primary decision-making framework. Thoughtful. The right response is to understand what that data set was measuring, to understand what is different about the current environment, and to make decisions about your financial positioning that reflect reality rather than the comfort of historical averages. That, to me, is what financial literacy looks like in 2026. Not panic, no denial. Clear eyes about what the data actually shows and what it doesn't. Thoughtful. Here's the question I want to leave you with today, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thinking in the comments. If the financial rails themselves are part of the conflict, if the infrastructure that connects the global economy is being contested, what is the asset that becomes most valuable? Not most liquid, most genuinely valuable. Think about that. I'll be reading every answer,